My name is Akash. I'm part of the Vectra product team. And what I primarily do is oversee all of our cloud portfolios. So when we think about protecting the cloud, um, be it AWS, be it Azure, be it identity, so Entra ID, M365, I sort of own that coverage. Um, the point of today's webinar is to sort of be to talk high level about how attacker behaviors in the wild are evolving. Sort of that's where I'll start. I'll start about on techniques that we're seeing pop up, the presence of these groups, these popular APT groups that have been in the wild. Where are they today? And then talk about dissecting some of the attacker techniques that we've seen, right? Talk about progressions. How do these folks infiltrate the environments that you have deployed in today, and then how they sort of move laterally to stages of exfiltration and impact. I'm going to try and keep this conversation focused on the cloud. I think in the context of Microsoft ecosystems, the cloud is a very interesting area for attackers. And so sort of that's going to be the focus of this conversation. But let's not take away from the fact that, and I will keep saying this term, hybrid. So hybrid, hybrid, hybrid. All attacks today are hybrid. So with that, let's get moving forward. I think the first thing to focus on is the news, right? Like, how do we learn about compromises today? It's through the media. What we're seeing out there is that while there's been a lot of investments and a lot of initiatives on the side of defenders to stop attacks and popular APT groups, there continues to be a presence of these groups in the attacks we're seeing in the wild today. We'll focus on a few specific ones. But in terms of the Microsoft ecosystem, I think it helps to hone in on why that is the case, right? It is a very tightly integrated ecosystem. You think about your cloud environment, which is where you may house data and have a lot of workloads, that integrates very tightly with your identity environment in Entra ID, which is sort of your doorway to the cloud, but not just to the cloud, also to all your SaaS apps. And so as an attacker, if I compromise one surface, I now have a way to meander or at least probe across and see if I can move laterally to connected trust surfaces. And that's what makes Microsoft an interesting and very lucrative area for an attacker to actually invest their time and energy in. So sort of how we're seeing that unfold, right? Over the last year, 2 years, we've seen a lot of names pop up in the media. And in terms of how those attacks are evolving, we've seen those come across as well. Let's talk about one of the big ones, Scattered Spider. If you're in the security industry, this name should not be new to you, right? Like you've heard it several times, mostly in the context of the MGM hack that happened earlier this year. Their targets are many across healthcare, finance, energy, government organizations. They're a decentralized group, primarily rely on not just their own tooling, which they've built, but also on ransomware as a service providers, right? You see often in the same breath, the terms Scattered Spider and Alpha V Black Cat being used. And so there's these partnerships that exist even in attacker domains where one is sort of an affiliate, one is a provider of tooling and techniques, which then the affiliate uses to cause impact. They're an English-speaking group, which makes their modus operandi very social engineering, right? They're able to talk to employees at organizations and convince them that they're calling for legitimate reasons or asking you to do things for legitimate business as usual reasons. What we've seen is that this group sort of went quiet for the earlier part of this year after the big MGM hack. We did see some arrests being made here, but interestingly, just a couple months back, we see techniques from this behavior pop up again. And this time it was in the manufacturing sector. It's interesting because what we're seeing is now not just the evolution of the techniques themselves, but the presence. So globally, they're sort of switching and moving to new regions where they haven't interacted in before. What sort of begs the question is who's actually doing this, right? Is it the same folks? Is it new folks that have sort of taken the techniques that have already been made public and are now using them? We also saw evolving partnerships. So where previously you would see Scattered Spider and Black Cat being spoken about in the same breath, we are now seeing Ransom Hub show up, which is just another provider of ransomware services. So another affiliate provider relationship. The targets for Scattered Spider continue to be identity and cloud environments. And that'll sort of be a theme of all the attacker groups that we see. In terms of sort of where they are right now and sort of what they're doing, we've seen them, the new techniques involved, and which are very similar to their previous ones, unmanaged VMs, right? Like deploy unmanaged VMs in areas that are either not monitored enough or not monitored at all. That allows them to bypass traditional security tooling, and then let's deploy ransomware on those VMs. Very, very archetype of Scattered Spider, but very alive and acting actively. The second one is Midnight Blizzard. I think this one's an interesting one where late last year, there was a lot of noise about Midnight Blizzard. Like Nobelium's been in the news for some time now. We saw them go quiet too, right? Like their exploitation sort of a modus operandi is let's target an identity, let's compromise an identity, and then find a way to pivot to other surfaces. We've seen them interact in cloud environments a lot of times, especially Microsoft Azure. Interestingly, Midnight Blizzard is one of those that's targeted huge organizations. So there's Microsoft, we've heard them in the context of SolarWinds, multiple government agencies. We saw them go quiet for some time too. But right around the same time Scattered Spider came back, we saw these folks pop in again as well. And the way this manifested was sort of this large scale information gathering compromise, where they're sending sort of attachments via email to a lot of folks in hundreds of organizations around the world, which are signed with signed RDP files, and they use Let's Encrypt certificate authorities to sign these files, which adds to them a degree of credibility. Now, once that happens, and I'm able to compromise an identity, that allows me to set up a C2. And once I do that, I sort of have access into the environment, which then allows me to move laterally and progress further. The end goal that we've seen sort of manifest in the cloud from Midnight Blizzard, primarily identity-centric attacks that target Entra ID, but in the cloud, it's got a lot to do with run commands on virtual machines, similar to sort of what we will see our next group do, which is Peach Sandstorm. Now, you may have heard about Scattered Spider and Midnight Blizzard being spoken about a lot. Peach Sandstorm is an interesting one, right? This is an Iran-backed threat actor that we've seen interact in Microsoft environments for some time. They were very, very active in 2023, and then we didn't see them for a while. However, in August of 2024, we saw them interact again in the context of Azure Cloud. They've found ways to infiltrate Azure Cloud, and again, you will have guessed it right, the anchor point is identity, move into the cloud, and they're now deploying subscriptions. And they do this via student subscriptions, which come with a unique set of privileges. Within those subscriptions, they're deploying resources. What we're seeing is that the attacks that Peach Sandstorm is sort of pursuing are more pass-focused, right? Where Scattered Spider and Midnight Blizzard are often going after your workloads in the cloud. Peach Sandstorm is a little bit unique in that they're abusing app services, which are sort of this serverless mechanism for you to run workflows in the cloud. Again, nuanced, but very interesting. And this is sort of where we see a lot of the attackers going. In terms of cloud environments, we see an increasing shift or paradigm shift from being primarily like IaaS specific, so virtual machine specific, to moving to evolving attacker techniques which are more PaaS specific. So this is around the management plane layer activity that we observe. So what are sort of our key takeaways based on what we're seeing? The first is all of these guys are alive and well, right? Like we're seeing arrests being made, we're seeing folks in the community put out uh, techniques to try and catch them. However, after some level of dormancy, the techniques that these attackers are using are now being used prevalently. Now, it's easy to say it's probably scattered spider or not. It's sort of a different question to answer, but fundamentally, the techniques are out there. And once they're out there, they're democratized by the community of attackers and leverage, right? The second is, I've said this a few times, identity. Today's attacks are not necessarily the traditional zero-day compromises that we would see. They're more social engineering based. Arguably, the most exposed asset that we have as defenders are our identities. And once an identity is compromised, attackers are very careful to make sure that they are not acting, as we would say, anomalously to raise suspicion. And so I think really taking a lens of not just an outside in view to establish the right boundaries, but an inside out view of what's happening within our boundaries is actually quite critical. And finally, I think if there's one takeaway from this entire presentation for you, it should be that every attack today is a hybrid attack. There is no notion of an attack that is not hybrid. Even if you are deploying in just Entra ID and Azure Cloud, for example, not even an on-prem environment, you still have more than one surface to protect. And I think that's something we just cannot lose sight of or cannot ignore anymore, right? It's not about signal in silos. It's about signal across the board that has to be something that we consider. So breaking that down a little bit further, like looking at how this actually manifests. Let's pick up scattered spider, right? Um, most of the techniques again start with identity compromise. So on the left, if you look, you see that there was social engineering, compromised credentials from a benign user, followed by swim swapping attacks to gather tokens, log into the environment. Compromises of Azure AD are usually followed by, after initial access, a way to set up persistence. So we saw this even in Midnight Blizzard. We've seen it in Scattered Spider, but setting up cross-tenant synchronization to make sure that you don't lose access to the Azure AD tenant that you have compromised or the Entra ID tenant to maintain persistence. But once that happens, what we see is that there are mechanisms for an attacker to move from that surface to a connected one. In this case, Azure Cloud. Once I'm in there, I have the ability to do one of several different things. Now, Microsoft's an interesting beast in this matter where depending on the level of logging you have and the kinds of logging you have, you are either seeing or not seeing certain behaviors. And we'll talk about that in a minute here. But once I'm in the environment, I'm first of all dumping credentials. This is archetype attacker behavior when it comes to reconnaissance in Azure Cloud, is just seeing what I have access to. Once I do that, I go after the key vaults, which are sort of the store of critical information, keys to the kingdom. I may or may not get in, but it's not as relevant. Even if I do not get in, I have the ability to leverage existing permissions to cause havoc. And the way Scattered Spider does it is unmanaged VMs, right? Like find a way for themselves to establish presence in an area you may not have deployed in currently, where policies may be weak. And as you'll notice, they have to get it right only once. Once that's done, they sort of see to into that particular virtual machine, deploy ransomware that they get mostly from elsewhere. So Ransom Hub's a big one, and then progress the attack further. A very traditional and archetype movement from Entra ID to Azure Cloud is what we see here with Scattered Spider. The other interesting thing is serial console usage. When you have a VM, you're able to use remote monitoring and management tools like serial console to log in and take actions. The authentication that's associated with serial console is often not as strong as traditional authentication methods that we see when deploying, when logging into a VM from, let's say, the portal. And this makes it increasingly challenging for us as defenders to monitor these nuanced features that come with VMs, but also uh, easy for an attacker to avoid detection, which is an important thing to note. Let's talk Pete Sandstorm. I actually feel this one's a bit more interesting, right? Where as we see evolving attacker techniques, we're seeing multiple pivots. Now we're seeing somebody that's compromised an identity using password spraying attacks. These guys are known for that. And brute force now is manifesting in several different ways. So I'd say like the traditional brute force is just go hard at it till you crack the password. Uh, Newer forms of brute force involve just validating you have the right credentials, even if you're not able to log in due to supplementary conditional access policies you may have. What we see is um, the error codes that are associated with the login, the failed login, tell you exactly what the reason was for why you weren't able to get in. And what that tells me is like sometimes I'm able to say that, hey, I've validated the credentials, so my creds are right, but because of some other control, I wasn't able to get in. And sometimes that's all an attacker needs, right? Like they need to validate the credentials are right for them to find other ways or other mechanisms to try and come back and access the environment. We're also seeing like slower brute force, where instead of a barrage of requests to get into the environment, we're now seeing them come more slowly. So almost like tapering off the number of attempts they make and spreading it out over a period of time. So brute force techniques are evolving that these attack groups are using. Now we've compromised Azure AD. Once I'm into your Entra ID Azure AD environment, I can use group memberships to elevate myself to global admin roles within Azure. A very, very common attack technique. In fact, we've uncovered this in customer environments ourselves over the past couple of months. Interestingly, once you're in the Azure environment, the level of access you have, the level of permissions you have as an identity are often more than you need for regular business actions. In the case of Pete Sandstorm, what we've seen is abusing of existing Azure subscriptions, which, if you're not familiar, is sort of this bucket of, let's say, resources. Um, but now with the new techniques that we saw earlier this year, we're seeing them create subscriptions, and that's interesting because it completely allows them to avoid detection uh, by bypassing traditional security controls and policies that may be in place, right? Like think about the term unmanaged. These are orphan subscriptions that they create. Once they create them, they deploy VMs, resources in this subscription. Like I mentioned before, these guys are going more PaaS. And as they go more platform as a service, what we're seeing is they're using cloud native features. Azure Automation, Azure App Services are big ones. You may have heard of Azure Automation, which is fundamentally a way for you to orchestrate workloads both in the cloud and in your connected on-premise environments. This is a very, very lucrative avenue for an attacker. In an environment that's hybrid, a single trust relationship that exists allows an attacker to use a feature that is normally very powerful and very useful to move into, let's say, your on-premise environment. And what we see is that most of these attacks, this compromising of your Azure AD Entra ID environment, pivoting to Azure, moving on and compromising your network environment happens in a matter of hours. Where traditionally we'd see an attacker be in your environment for a long period of time before actually taking action, doing full recon. In the cloud, what we're observing is that credentials are ephemeral, right? Your tokens are valid only for a certain amount of time. So time is of the essence. And time is of the essence, not just for the attacker, but for the defender. So all of this happens in a matter of hours. Once I've made my pivot, I now have access unfettered to the environment. So when you look at this broadly, in hindsight, when it's put on a slide and I attach the steps to it and the progression, it makes a lot of sense. It also seems very obvious, right? Like elevated permissions via group memberships, anonymization, understandable. Recon in the cloud, moving towards the only services I have deployed, and acting against them. During an active incident, however, this audit trail is actually extremely hard to identify and surface. So I think that's another thing we want to keep in mind is surfacing of the audit trail across trust surfaces. The other important thing to note is a lot of hybrid attacks originate from trust relationships. I've said this a few times, trust relationships that already exist. When a trust relationship exists, you're likely not monitoring those relationships as closely as you would let's say, a new identity logging into the environment. And so understanding what your existing tooling gives you in that space is actually quite critical. All right. I've been alluding to Azure a lot. I do want to talk about why it's so challenging to protect Azure cloud. Signal in silos is not as useful or cannot be operationalized as well as Signal across your hybrid environment. But in the context of Azure cloud, firstly, you have to configure everything, which is a challenge in itself. I think that's not something that a lot of us as defenders worry about too much, right? You can do that via policies in Azure cloud. You can do that via IAM specifically. There are ways to orchestrate configuration, to orchestrate these relationships that exist between identities, services, and data. Doing that at scale, however, is actually quite challenging. We often see gaps being left, and any changes or misconfigurations that are deployed are usually deployed at scale. The second is configuration sprawl, right? I think for any of you that are now moving to Azure or fully deployed in Azure, have mature cloud environments, you may have noticed that there are over 200 services in Azure. You'll also have noticed that the metadata that Azure provides from a security lens to audit any action that's taken in the cloud is actually quite, to put it mildly, diverse, right? You have a lot of different log sources. You have to turn them on a la carte. For each of the different flavors of logs, you get to choose specifically almost like what you want made visible. And as defenders, that's actually quite convoluted for us, is because we have to figure out, okay, what do I turn on? What is the level of visibility I need? Am I protected in this space and not in this space? And it's almost like I'm hedging my bets, which is a very risky place to be in. And I think finally, I mentioned scale, right? Like today's environments move at breakneck speed. And when that happens, we see deployments made to production environments tens of times a day. In that world, any change that's made that could lead to an opening for an attacker proliferates very, very quickly. What that means is for an attacker, they need just one opening, right? I often say, when I speak with our customers, this often comes up, is as a defender, you are obligated to be right every single time. As an attacker, I have to be right just once, right? And so thinking about the surfaces you have to protect in the context of the size of your environment is actually quite critical. So we've spoken about quite a few things. I want to start to try and tie this all together, right? So what are sort of the key takeaways of this particular session? The first is attackers go dormant. Their techniques do not. Their techniques are democratized, right? In fact, we see improvement in reuse of these techniques. We're seeing that with Scattered Spider, with Midnight Blizzard, and most recently with Pete Sandstorm. Once a technique is made public, it doesn't stop script kiddies from using it. So if I really had to summarize this, I wouldn't say like Scattered Spider is an APT group, right? Like Scattered Spider is now just a collection of techniques that anybody can use. And it's extremely important for us to understand that and almost comprehend that, because they're not going anywhere. The second is the Microsoft ecosystem, right? Especially in the context of Azure Cloud, continues to be a very lucrative target for hybrid attackers, primarily because of how difficult it is to protect this surface. It's been a significant area of research for us in the past couple of years. And we've learned the hard way that protecting this surface exhaustively can be very, very challenging. And then finally, identity-centric visibility. across hybrid threat surfaces is vital. Um, let's unpack that a little bit. So I've alluded to hybrid threat surfaces several times in this presentation. You have connected environments that are working in tandem to help you accomplish business goals. You need to protect them. That's a granted. Identity-centric is an interesting one, right? We often see some of our customers that are trying to be alert-centric, right? Like, let me look at individual actions and see what's suspicious. In the cloud, given how ephemeral credentials are, that changes very quickly. Where in Azure, I could be using a combination of a role and scope, so a role assignment to do an action. Tomorrow, I could use a different one. And so merely looking at the target or merely looking at the operations that are that are happening in your environment is a recipe for a lot of pain and a lot of noise that you have to deal with. Identity-centric analysis fundamentally means think about this from the perspective of who is doing the action and where are they acting. Are they just acting in one surface? Are they acting across the board? To me, it doesn't matter. As long as I have an identity-centric view of everything that identity does across my environments, I have a better barometer of risk. And that allows me to better categorize and bring clarity to the work that I'm doing from a security lens, right? So identity-centric and not action-centric. Make sure that you're looking at this from the perspective of who is doing the action and where are they acting. That allows you to identify risk significantly easier. So this was supposed to be a short and sweet presentation on sort of how we're seeing these attack groups, the methods from these attack groups evolve. I think we will continue to see them. And so like being vigilant for us is actually quite critical. The resources section of this webinar does have a lot of interesting collateral for you to review. I think understanding the gaps in your environment is obviously a big step that you have to take. We have a lot of tooling that helps you test. So Halberd is an open source tool. MADAF is a framework that we have out there to test against identity-centric threats. This is a homework exercise, right? Like you'll have to do some reading, get in touch with us. We're happy to help where we can. Fundamentally, it's about identifying those areas of critical importance and then acting in those spaces. I also want to tease sort of like, while this was supposed to be a socializing the problem webinar, I did mention this has been an active area of research for us over the past almost 2-3 years, thinking about hybrid attacks as a whole, visibility into that audit trail as a whole. And we have arrived at what we believe is a very compelling solution in this space. So we do have a webinar again next week where we'll talk about sort of like our perspective on this specific problem and what our proposed solution is, right? Like how do we think about actually tackling this? So I would highly recommend that you all join and definitely interact more with us through that forum. So I see we're at the 30-minute mark. I want to be respectful of time. I think I'll take one question, but for those who have to drop, thank you so much for taking the time to join. I do see one question that's come in chat here. How do I test my current security controls in Azure? That's an interesting one, right? Like fundamentally, we get this question a lot. Is like what tooling should I get? I tried to keep this webinar very tooling agnostic. I don't think it helps to dive into a tool-centric approach from the get-go. My primary recommendation would be to take a step back and think about this a bit more strategically, right? As defenders, when I talk to customers, one of the things that I'm often pushing them to do is start seeing and buying into the hybrid lens. Hybrid is not the future. Hybrid attacks are the present. Any investments you make in the security space, be that something you're building in-house or something that you are getting help for from a vendor outside, has to be grounded in the one question, is how are you stopping hybrid attacks? That has to be the anchor point of any conversation you have. protection for Azure cloud, AWS cloud, your network environment is great. But if you're not able to see the movement across these surfaces, you are not categorizing risk efficiently. There's a lot of pain that comes with that. And we're seeing that live in environments that are being hijacked today. My second opinion here is a bit controversial. It's assumed compromise, right? Too often I see our partners and customers rely primarily on preventative tooling, right? It's great. Like, you want the boundaries to be as strong as possible, but taking a lens of just preventative is often doomed to fail, right? Today's attackers or today's attack techniques demand that we look at these behaviors from a responsive lens. Like, you need to know what's happening within your environment, not just who's coming in, but what they're doing once they're inside. Too often attackers masquerade as benign users. We see this all the time. And so, like, these social engineering efforts are quite hard to discern by just your normal preventative barriers. You have to think about what's happening within your environment. And finally, I would say test rigorously. I would say even before you invest in any tooling at all, understand where you are. And to do that, you have to run tests. So there's obviously evolving attacker techniques. We're a good resource. There's plenty of good community-based resources out there that talk about how these attackers are moving, the techniques they're trying to leverage to hack into environments. Take stock of where you are today. And then based on that, make a decision of, okay, how do I see my environment evolving over time? And is my security stack enough to counter or to defend that sort of like that environment I want to eventually deploy, right? We want to take a long-term view, like from a horizon perspective, not something that I'm trying to solve for next week, but how do I see my organization's environment evolving over time? At the end of the day, we're together in this community. I would highly recommend you reach out to us to talk about this. This is fundamentally what we invest a lot of our security research and data science expertise into figuring out. But the overarching takeaway here is we need to be vigilant. These attackers are continuing to proliferate their techniques. We will see more of them. Democratization is quick and they move fast. So making sure you have the term hybrid in mind and identity in mind as you think about protecting all your environments, especially your cloud, is actually quite critical. I see we have a couple more questions coming into chat. We are reaching close to time. So what I'll do is I'll set up some conversations offline and contact folks that have dropped in questions for us to chat. But again, I really appreciate everybody taking the time to stop by and listen to us discuss this quite important topic. Thank you again. Appreciate y'all's time. Have an awesome one and stay safe.